This is going to be part 2 of the How to Recreate Your Favorite Jacket But Make It Better series. If you haven't seen part 1, where have you been? Go ahead and check that out in the link in the description down below. Making jackets takes a lot of time, just as I said in the first video. And I'm pretty sure you all understand what happened from there on out, so let's move on to today's video, which is drafting and patterning everything else. Let's start easy with the pocket. This draft is just a tapered square since this pocket is a little shaped at the top. And now it's onto the pattern. So at the top here we have a 1-inch seam allowance, whereas the sides have a 1/2-inch seam allowance. That allows us to fold it down and then connect it to the pocket lining so it's nice and clean at the top. Then down at the bottom we have a 1.5-inch seam allowance. It's going to be rolled under as part of the jacket bottom hem right now. I don't know if I'm going to keep it that way, but we'll see as I make the jacket muslin. Now we're moving on to the second easiest draft and pattern, the belt. Could it still be slightly annoying? Yes, because it is one long rectangle and mine will have a tapered end, but that's it. I just made mine a cut and fold pattern piece to save some pattern paper, but you can make yours full length if you want. I just did 1/2-inch seam allowances all around except at the center back since that's on fold. I also shaped the tip of the belt seam allowance to help guide me while sewing. Time for the main attraction of the video, how to draft the top collar. It is very much the danger zone for many people while pattern making, especially me. So to help out with all the specifics, I'm using a drafting guide from the Thread blog. We already drafted the lapel as part of the body, but now we have to do the second part, which is the top collar. Really fun, right? I still like the button detail for the lapel and top collar, so I'll be making those placements once I had the patterns finalized. The top collar shape that you start off with is on the half, so we'll be putting that right up there on the neckline. Now I couldn't tell you why, but we did this at FIT as well. You are going to move your neckline a 1/4 inch in towards your shoulder and mark that as point A. Now as for point B, I just went ahead and marked my break point as point B. I don't know who figured this one out, but extend the shoulder line out by 1 inch and mark that as point C. Then go ahead and connect point C to your break point, point B. This is known as your roll line. Then we're going to mark where the top collar meets the front neckline, aka where the knot shape is formed. This isn't on the Threads guide, but it helps with recreating collars, whereas the guide is more for initial drafting. And that one will be labeled point D. Next up is the back neckline portion of the collar. Measure out the length of just the back neckline from shoulder seam to center back. Then draw out a line perpendicular to the front shoulder seam from point A at that length. Label that point E. Point F is up next, and all you have to do is mark the midway point from point E to point A. Point G will be marking the center back neck drop. However, I wouldn't suggest doing more than 1/2 inch, and I'll show you why when we get to the pattern. Then extend that measurement perpendicular from point E to point A. Go ahead and connect point G to point F. We are then going to extend the line from point F to point E to make it the full center back top collar length. If you're changing yours a bit, make sure you leave enough length for it to roll over and look nice. Mark that point H. Before you draw on the outer collar edge, connect point A to point D with a curve. This won't be part of the front body pattern, so you can dash the line if it helps you remember not to copy it. From point H, we'll mark out half of the total collar point length at the outer edge. Be sure to keep your collar width the same throughout, unless you want it to be completely different. It doesn't hurt to recheck your measurements or what you want the new length to be either. That is what drafting is for. You can then mark that outer point, point I, and you can connect point I to point Z on the neckline. Double check that measurement though to see if it adds up to what you want. The outer edge isn't an entirely flat line, so around where the shoulder seam would hit the collar outer edge if it had been continued. Go about a 1/4 inch out and reconnect the outer edge to that point with a curve. All we have left now is to curve the corner. So I'll just measure how far away from the corner that the curve starts both vertically and horizontally and mark those measurements on each side. Since it's such a tiny curve, I don't have a tool for that, and I'm going to freehand it to the best of my abilities. Then we can just go ahead and erase those extra lines as if they never existed. The lapel can now be rounded out in the same manner as the top collar. And now that we have it so beautifully curved, we're just fingers crossed that this actually works. Here's a little side-by-side comparison of the jacket versus the draft. As you can see, I patterned out the collar and now there is a dip at the top and bottom of the collar, and we don't want that. This is why I said you don't want to do more than ½ inch in the back neck drop for point G. The back neckline will never dip like that, so we need the collar neckline to somewhat match the back neckline. To correct this, we'll raise the pattern only where that dip is and equally from top to bottom so we can keep the same collar width. Only raise it just enough to where there is very little to no dip. I'm going to leave a little bit of the dip just so we can see what it looks like on the muslin. If you want to see how the muslin turns out, I will be doing a Facebook and Instagram exclusive on making the muslin along with how to pick out the fabric for your jacket. I'll be posting those after some fun Halloween content, so be sure to follow either one of my accounts, which I'll be leaving links for in the description down below. Back to the pattern. Once your center back is smoothed out, if you needed to correct it, go ahead and mark notches in the seam allowance for where the shoulder seam will hit. That will greatly help with placing the collar when it comes to sewing, especially since the collar and neckline can stretch out a little during construction. Don't forget to mark your center back line, which is also your grain line for this piece. For now, I did ½ inch seam allowances all around, but I will adjust to smaller seam allowances after checking out the muslin's fit. The top collar will be cut to, and I'll trim off 1/8 of an inch on one of the pieces to help make the outer edges look nice when I sew them. Then I'll just free the pattern from its paper shackles and we're all set. Time for the facings. Alright y'all, the facings not only make the jacket edges look neat, but the lapel facing is what you see when it is turned back. You can have fun with this by putting a contrasting fabric of similar weight, or do what most people do and use the same fabric. The front facing runs all the way to the jacket hem and connects at the shoulder seam. This jacket doesn't have it, but most will have a back neck facing as well. A good rule of thumb for the facing is about 2 inches wide in the shoulder seam area. You don't want it too skinny or else it sets you up oddly for the facing shape in the lapel area. I'll just go ahead and mark those 2 inches out for the shoulder seam facing width, and then down at the jacket hem I'll do about 3 inches wide or so. This makes it a little bit easier to connect around the roll line without such an odd shape. Now again, the front facing is supposed to be visible when the lapel is turned over, so you don't want it to be skinnier than where the roll line hits on your draft. With that in mind, it's easier to just keep the same width from the hem up until you reach the roll line and carve it away from there. If you need help distinguishing the lines while you're patterning, you can always label it front facing and or do it in a different color. For the back neck facing, follow the same curves as your back neckline and keep it the same width throughout. I did mine at 2 inches so it connects with the front facing. I forgot to film this, but you only need 3/8 to ½ inch seam allowance for all your facings. I didn't show you this in the part 2 video, but in order to finish this draft, we are going to make the top of the armhole a nice shape. By that I mean we don't want any odd bumps or curves at the top, so we are going to line up the front and back shoulder seam. This is where it's really important that you drafted your back bodice with the center back on the left side and the side seam on the right. That way your armhole and your neckline lines up nicely. You don't want to do what I had to do, which was some pattern magic involving flipping over the draft and copying my marks. Once the top of the armhole is smoothed out from front to back, you then get to do the same thing at the bottom of the armhole at the side seam. Although not the easiest thing to do with the side seam, a pro tip is to fold back the seam allowance area on either the front or back draft and then do your corrections. As you can see, I now have a nice little scoop at the bottom of my armhole, unlike some factory and commercial patterns. But wait, there's more! You not only get to scoop out the armhole, you also get to scoop out the neckline as well. So make sure the front and back are scooped just like your armhole, so that way they're nice and smooth and no bumps. And with that, I present to you the final front draft of the jacket and the final back draft of the jacket. On to the front patterns. I gave all my front patterns ½ inch seam allowances except at the bottom hem, since these are first draft patterns and it gives a little room for adjustment. The bottom hem got 1½ inch seam allowance so it can be turned back and connected to the lining for a clean finish. get ready because the back is so much dissimilar. Oh my gosh, wow, I totally got you guys. So 1/2 inch all around except at the bottom hem, which is 1.5 inches. And don't forget to mark your notches because those are helpful. That didn't work. There we go. All right, and don't forget to do your back pleats because that helps with movement while wearing the jacket. I'm sure you could tell me by now what seam allowances I did for the sleeve, but just in case, I did a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around except at the sleeve hem, which was 1.5 inches. I marked notches halfway down the sleeve seams with a single notch for the front side and double notches for the back. At the sleeve cap, I marked a notch at the halfway point on the front curve, while the back didn't need it since the seam hits at the back halfway point. To create the underarm piece, you first trace off one side to the underarm seam. I started off with the back and leave the original underarm seam very light, or as a couple dashes. Mark your notches and then go ahead and move the pattern to the other side of the sleeve. Match up the original underarm seam and notches, then trace the other side and add in the new notch. An interesting thing happens when you do this method, and that is it won't line up 100% evenly at the bottom. So all you need to do is blend the bottom hem so it becomes even, and you're all set. And that is where our patterning and drafting will end up until we go ahead and put it into muslin. Again, if you want to see how to fit that muslin and how to choose your fabric for your new jacket, I will be adding those into some exclusive to Facebook and Instagram short videos. Also, thank you so much if you made it this far into the video. I really appreciate it. And as always, take care, and I'll be seeing you here in the next video. Bye! Jacket series, but make it better. This